Story 1. I left some grass clippings in a barrel. It rained, got hot, and I discovered it a couple of weeks later. The top was hard, so I thought I would dump it out. My daughter, who was 3 or 4 at the time, was standing next to me while I dumped it. I flipped over the barrel and had to hit it a couple of times. What came next was this slimy, green mush that splashed on both me and my daughter. She immediately gagged and started dry heaving. I ran through the yard, carrying my toddler at arm's length while she cried and dry heaved. I took us both through the shower, and for the next couple of days, no matter the soap and scrubbing, I could still smell it on our skin. Story 2. While moving to Wyoming with my family, the radiator cap broke in the middle of the Nevada desert, causing the water to evaporate. Since we didn't have any water, my dad pulled to the side of the road and found bottles left by truckers. He used the contents to refill the radiator. I woke up to that smell. I have no experience with tear gas, but boiling urine is something akin to that. It burned my eyes and throat slightly, not enough to stop breathing, but the smell was indescribable. I would give anything to never go through that again. Story 3. Rotted or decaying flesh, public toilets on the last day of a music festival, and boxes full of waste that has been baking in the sun. Story 4. A dead body was pulled up on the beach after 4 days of decomposition underwater, its skin torn open and releasing a large cloud of decomposition gases. Story 5. The smell of a rotting human was overwhelming. A relative had passed away, and he went unnoticed for a week. By the time he was found, the odor in the house was unbearable. Story 6. Bed sores fused to fabric after sitting in a chair constantly were freshly opened while attempting to lift the individual into an ambulance. Story 7. I have never had the displeasure of being near a rotting corpse like some people here, so I will just say grease trap. I honestly do not have a reference for what they smell like. Story 8. Rotting flesh. I have no idea how the deer got onto the freeway, but I don't think I will ever walk that way again. Unfortunately, I needed to cash my paycheck. Story 9. There is a stink bug in Thailand that produces an incredibly unpleasant odor. It is a small insect, but it can certainly drive you to the brink of sanity. Story 10. I was a paramedic in a past life, so I've encountered it all. The one experience that still haunts me involved a homeless man with diabetes. We had just endured over 2 weeks of torrential downpour. All homeless individuals have a certain scent, and while I understand and empathize with the reasons behind this man was different. As soon as the doors shut, I was overwhelmed by a number of substantial odors. He had many complaints, but it was primarily foot discomfort, so I needed to examine his legs and feet to determine how best to assist him. He was wearing thick, tall socks and 2 layers of compression stockings. Let me tell you, with each layer I removed, my regrets about life multiplied. The final layer was where things took a turn for the worse. As I pulled them off, much of his skin came with them. The poor man's legs were nothing but necrotic tissue, with a severe case of trench foot on top of that. It was the most aggressively putrid smell I've ever encountered. The odor from this situation far surpassed that of deceased individuals who had been lying in front of a heater for 3 weeks. It wasn't just that the smell resembled a severely decaying body. It was the fact that it came from a living person that made it so unbearable. I felt deeply for the man, but I could not hide my disdain for the situation. Story 11. I worked in a hospital and received a late call about the meat bucket. The kitchen puts bones and old meat in there, anything that could not be served to the patients. It was late and hot, so we collected it and placed it in the courtyard to dispose of it the next day. 3 days later, during an extremely hot summer, one of our staff members exclaimed that we had forgotten the meat bucket. We attempted to throw it in the trash, but just opening the bucket caused 3 people to vomit. One of them was an unfortunate staff member from administration who got sick all over some files he was carrying. There were no complaints of feeling unwell. The smell of the rotten meat was overwhelming and made you immediately nauseous. Nothing can compare to that smell. Even 30 years later, I still vividly remember how dreadful it was. Story 12. A deceased individual was found after almost a week. One of my best friends had a friend who had no family, except for a 90-year-old mother in a nursing home, and essentially no friends. This friend was technically his bookkeeper for a small beekeeping business, and he had befriended him. The man used steroids, was quite large, and also dabbled in cocaine and pills. He allowed my friend to store some belongings at his house after a breakup with his long-term girlfriend. My friend hadn't heard from him in a week, so he went to his house to check on him and retrieve his items. He used the hidden key to enter, heard the CPAP machine running, and assumed he was asleep. He went to the bathroom and called out, "Steve, it's noon. Get up." When there was no response, he yelled again, "Come on, get up. Let's go have lunch." But still received no answer. After finishing in the bathroom, he approached the bedroom door and found him in bed. He had died in his sleep, and the CPAP machine was pumping fluid all over the bed and floor. I went over a day or two later to help him clear out the house. That was years ago, but I can still vividly remember the smell. It was overwhelming. Story 13. When I was a child, my appendix burst. For the next 10 days, every time I went to the bathroom while the poison drained out of me, the smell was unlike anything I have experienced before or since. Story 14. I have been doing biohazard remediation for 9 years. The smell of decay is familiar to me, but one time in a recreational vehicle where a man shot himself, it went unrecovered for months, and the cleanup was relatively easy. Then I encountered the refrigerator. It was filled with gigantic slug-like maggots. There was spoiled meat and no electricity. I found handfuls of slithery, squirming half-inch worm-like creatures that I had to put into a contractor trash bag, only for them to crawl back out from behind the plastic. It was the most unpleasant odor I have ever experienced. I would pay to avoid that again. Story 15. Rotten eggs. When I was 12, I went to crack an egg into a bowl to make cookies, but the egg exploded, creating a mess of black gunk everywhere. The smell was so terrible that I can't find words to describe it. I did not make cookies that day or for a very long time afterward. Story 16. One of my former coworkers never showered, not even during her periods. I can't describe the smell. It was not regular body odor. She is a nice person, but she needs to see a doctor. I struggled to write this. Story 17. I sometimes work with elderly individuals who live in harsh conditions. I had to remove a commode chair that was uncleaned for several years and filled with waste. I ultimately had to throw it out when I discovered it was firmly lodged in the bowl. The smell of that will forever haunt me. Story 18. My brother got water under his arm cast, and when they took it off, it was horrific. That was 40 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. Story 19. Aside from my comment about Clostridium difficile, I'll provide my own answer. I encountered over 50-year-old gear oil from the rear differential of a classic car I was restoring. I never thought I would experience a petroleum-based product that smelled truly rotten and rancid. It was one of the few smells that made me actively gag. Story 20. My then boyfriend, now husband's worst-smelling fart happened in the frozen food aisle of Kroger. I walked right into it and almost passed out. Story 21. Burning human flesh. When I was in the Navy, I was standing duty at the Shore Patrol office. I accompanied them to a radar site where a man somehow was burned over most of his body from electricity. It was an awful smell. He did not survive. Story 22. Childbirth is an experience that is difficult to describe, especially the smell of amniotic fluid, blood, and other biological fluids that emerge together with the baby. It's quite unpleasant. Story 23. Bacterial vaginosis is often noticeable during intimacy, which can ruin the mood. It took me a long time to realize that it should not have that odor and that it can be treated with a simple regimen of antibiotics. Story 24. A patient with a colostomy bag had a prolapsed stoma and possibly an infection. The colostomy bag split, creating an overwhelming odor. The receptionist became ill from the smell, and I stepped over to check the patient in. I felt bad for the patient, who was clearly embarrassed. I tried to make him feel better, but the situation was hard to ignore. A few weeks later, he returned, all fixed up, and gifted me a stuffed animal squirrel. I loved that squirrel. Unfortunately, he eventually passed away. Story 25. I know people share colorful and interesting anecdotes, but for me, it's the scent of my body spray from one of the lowest periods of my life. I kept the spray for a few more years, and one day I used it again. I realized what it represented and decided to throw it away. I'm never going back. Story 26. The smell of the mucus my dad coughed up in my car during his chemotherapy for lung cancer was unforgettable. Fortunately, I haven't had to smell it in 18 years. Unfortunately, my children never got to meet their grandpa. Story 27. The smell of a scared and stressed skunk. I lived with a woman who tried to unsuccessfully drown the family of skunks living under her porch in a 5-gallon bucket of water. All she did was anger them, and that smell permeated the entire house and lingered endlessly. Story 28. When you are working out next to someone with a strong body odor that smells like a mixture of onions, sweat, feet, and deodorant trying to cover it up. Story 29. They have fish stations where fishermen discard fish guts and remnants at marinas. I used to clean them out, and some would have been sitting there for a while in the heat. The smell and the number of maggots are disgusting. Can make you feel nauseous or faint. Story 30. The smell of rotten death left behind in my family home during Hurricane Katrina was utterly vile and forever entwined with the death of my dad. Story 31. The smell of the house I had not been in for years belonged to a relative who was a hoarder. It was a very sad situation. Almost 2 years later, I still get a random whiff of that smell from something in the storage unit, which makes me cringe and feel sad. Story 32. Grease trap and sewer lines under a Chinese buffet can produce an overwhelming odor. I am unsure what kind of oil or grease is used in cooking, but when it goes rancid, the smell is more unpleasant than that of rotting meat decomposing on a hot day. If you get that substance on your clothes, you might as well throw them away, as it is nearly impossible to remove. Story 33. The stink spirit. I used to take the Washington, D.C. Metro to work. One stop in, a 400-pound homeless man got on, and when the train doors closed, an overwhelming stench hit my nose. It was like a month-old, unwashed body combined with rancid body odor. He was halfway across the car from me, and it was so bad I could taste the smell when I breathed through my mouth. Everyone piled off the car at the next stop. That was when I learned to avoid train cars with only one person on them. A few months later, I got on a train during the evening rush hour and caught a momentary whiff of the stink spirit. He had clearly been on the same car earlier, and the smell had somehow permeated. A month later, I picked up my wife from one of the stations, and she described the same smell. I never saw the guy, but we started calling him the stink spirit. Story 34. The lady in the apartment next to me passed away. After a few days of it starting to smell different than a bag of garbage, they conducted a wellness check and found her. She was probably dead for 4 or 5 days, they thought. She also weighed about 400 pounds. So the police didn't take her body that night. They had to arrange for a special pickup, which didn't happen until the next day. The smell was unbearable. It's hard to explain. It gets imprinted on your brain in a primal way. I got a can of air freshener and sprayed the entire can in my living room. I didn't read the instructions and felt a terrible burning in my throat and lungs after seeing the warning to avoid spraying for more than 3 seconds and to refrain from being in the room. The smell of death combined with the burning sensation in my throat and lungs was overwhelming. Carolyn, I know we didn't get along too well after you smashed the air freshener in the back hallway. That wouldn't have been necessary if you had just occasionally taken your garbage out. Seems like you got the last laugh, though. You win. Story 35. Dead animal. We have cattle, and when they die, it's overwhelming. But those buzzards jump right in there. Another thing I smelled nearly 50 years ago was when my dad took me to one of those industrial chicken farms, the ones that produce eggs. They washed all the waste into 2 retention ponds. One would be active while the other was drying into chicken manure. They had a metal walkway extending over each pond. For some reason, I walked out on the walkway above the active pond. I looked down, and it was green and bubbling with gases. To this day, I still remember that smell. It was worse than a dead carcass, to be honest. Story 36. I really dislike the smell of cannabis and cannot understand how anyone could enjoy it. Why smell like a skunk when you can eat an edible and achieve the same effect? Story 37. I do taxidermy and had some animal heads shipped to me for cleaning. They were in small plastic bags, and I had to wet and wash them before giving them to the beetles. They smelled terrible, and I always dreaded taking out the next one. Partially decomposed faces with tongues cut and sticking out eyeballs in various conditions are quite unpleasant. I believe cigarette smoke was involved as well as the typical rot because the smell was very strong. The finished product was worth the effort, but it was not enjoyable. It ruined certain foods for me because I swear they taste similar, like some salads and bitter foods. Sometimes I think I can still smell them. I've handled many other dead animals, but these were by far the worst. I have an incredibly poor sense of smell, but nothing can make me forget that experience. Story 38. A severe sinus infection can create an unpleasant odor that feels constant, as if something is decaying. It is important to seek medical attention if you have a bacterial infection of this nature, as a doctor can prescribe antibiotics to help you feel better. Story 39. A gastrointestinal bleed occurred when my brother-in-law had his gallbladder removed, and his intestine was accidentally nicked during the procedure. He ended up back in the hospital for several days, and the smell of his gas and bowel movements made the entire floor of the hospital almost unbearable. Story 40. Slaughtered minks emit a stench similar to a filthy hamster cage, amplified significantly. Growing up, I lived about a mile from a mink farm, and whenever they were slaughtered, the entire area was overwhelmed by the foul odor. I will never forget that terrible smell. Story 41. The stockyards outside of Amarillo, Texas. We were so excited to be within 30 minutes of our hotel after driving 8 hours. We were positively giddy at the thought of stretching out. For context, I and my service dog were on a cross-country road trip with my mom. All of a sudden, a wall of stench hit the car. I have smelled decomposition, abscess pus, and worse as a veterinary technician. This was worse than parvovirus feces in a swamp in August. Even my dog was trying to burrow into her bed in the back seat. My mom, in her infinite wisdom, thought the stench of 1,000 hells was emanating from inside the car and proceeded to drop all the windows. This had the effect of smacking us straight in the sinuses with the blinding stink. Realizing her error, she raised the windows and then tried to vent the stink by turning up the air conditioning. Now, we were being blasted in the face with icy air. Finally, she turned off the air conditioning, closed the vents, and we just looked at each other in absolute shock. The smell had by this point lodged itself squarely in our sinuses and was flatly refusing to exit my memory. I did the only thing I could. I started dry heaving. We all started dry heaving. We pulled into the hotel still randomly dry heaving. We stumbled up to the desk and inquired about what level of decay we had just driven through and why it wouldn't vacate our sinuses. That's when we learned about the stockyards. Never again. It's been 6 years, and we still just start randomly laughing over it. Story 42. Cellulitis of the labia or genital area of an excessively obese person, gangrene, or infested or burned tissue. I used to be an emergency medical technician. Story 43. Until I was 27, I thought the smell of mothballs was the breath of elderly people. It frustrated me and left me confused, wondering why certain older individuals had such a distinct and unpleasant breath that was noticeable even from behind. I have experienced the smell of dead bodies and have worked for several restoration companies, where I encountered awful crime scenes and sewage backups. However, the smell of mothballs affected me on another level. Story 44. It's a strange experience for me. There's a particular spray-on conditioner we used when my mom was in end-of-life care. I can go from being the happiest person one moment to immediately breaking down into tears when I smell that scent. Story 45. Slug soup. I have worked in the care industry most of my life and have been exposed to some horrendous odors. However, slug soup made me nauseous. It was a summer in the United Kingdom. A few days of sun were followed by a week of heavy rain, which brought the slugs out in force. I had the bottom of a cat litter tray that was going to the tip in my back garden, and it had become the perfect swimming pool for the slugs, with no ladder for them to escape. My God, there was a pool party. I was in the garden near the tray and kept getting a waft of sickly sweet hot cheese mixed with some type of chemical odor being carried across the breeze and into my nostrils. The worst part was that I took a couple of deep sniffs to try and locate the source of the stench, but couldn't imagine what was causing such an awful smell that wasn't a rotting alien corpse. I soon noticed the tray, roughly 1/3 full of water but full of slugs that were nearly flat. I tapped the tray with my foot and disturbed even more of the smell. The moment the odor hit me, it sent me into a frenzy, flailing wildly to dissipate the stench. But sadly, it was in vain. The stench was inside me. I ripped open the side gate and stumbled into the lane, collapsing above the neighbor's drain and letting the vomit flow forth. Every now and then, during this internal torture, a light breeze would carry more of the fumes, enough that my stomach was also trying to escape through my mouth. Once my body was shaky and frail due to a lack of nutrition, I held my breath and tipped the foul mixture down the drain, fighting back every urge to collapse at the sight of it. The only thing that made it bearable was hearing my neighbor scream, "What is that?" That nearly made me laugh. Nearly. To this day, that smell haunts my dreams, and when I share the story, I often think about ramming a pencil up each nostril and headbutting a desk just so I never have to think again. Story 46. A 5-day rotting body in a house with no air conditioning in the dead of South Texas heat in July was an unbearable experience. The smell was horrific. You could detect it from the driveway. When we opened the front door, the stench nearly knocked us over. The police officers, firemen, and emergency medical technicians on scene were retching before we could even take 5 steps inside. We had to leave and apply peppermint oil to disposable masks to help mask the odor. It provided some relief, but the smell was still present. A nurse friend had shared that little trick with me, and it works wonders. The man was slumped in his living room with a remote control in his hand. There were no weapons, pills, syringes, or marks on him that suggested anything other than a suicide or homicide. However, it was difficult to determine due to his extreme obesity. If he were still alive, he would have weighed close to 500 pounds. He died of heart failure, which intensified the smell because there was more of him to decompose, including a significant amount of fat. I know other people have experienced something similar, and you understand what I'm referring to. I have responded to scenes with decomposition before, but facing an environment with no air conditioning in nearly 110-degree weather made everything I'd ever encountered smell like roses. After that horrendous experience, nothing that is supposed to smell bad bothers me anymore, as that foul odor still lingers in all of us. Story 47. A body had been in the ocean for 3 weeks during the summer before it was discovered and reported to us. I was in the Coast Guard, and we went out to recover the body and prepare it for the medical examiner. I couldn't get the smell out of my uniform and boots, so I had to throw them away. I can still smell it 13 years later. Story 48. When I was 15 during the summer in Georgia, we were heading home from school when we saw several emergency vehicles, including an ambulance, by the side of the road. Someone had died and had been missing for a few days. The first responders, including the coroner, were there in full suits with large fans set up behind them blowing air past them and across the deceased. The body had swollen a bit in the summer heat, and they were going to degas it before removing it. I caught a whiff while we were passing by on the other side of the street, upwind. It was instantly gag-inducing. Story 49. My husband's bad breath is definitely not the worst smell, but it is the one I encounter most frequently. Story 50. How have so many people smelled dead bodies? I find it alarming how common this seems based on the replies to this post. Story 51. Preface. I have a strong feeling that the best choice here is to go with a scent I strongly dislike but encounter frequently, rather than the worst scent I have ever experienced if I am unlikely to encounter it again. That being said, it is probably artificial coconut aroma. Story 52. A body was in the morgue when I worked at a hospital. The family did not claim her because they could not afford a funeral. She was 36 years old and died of breast cancer. She remained in the morgue for almost 8 months, and her fluids settled at the bottom of the bag. Story 53. My grandmother has dementia. I went to her house to visit. Normally, She has one of the freshest, best-smelling homes I have ever been in, but this time there was a strong odor coming from the kitchen. I took out the trash, cleaned the sink, and cleared out the fridge, but I still couldn't find the source. Finally, I got ready to leave, and as we turned off the light, I noticed the oven light was on. Inside the oven, there were bags of rotten, liquefied potatoes and onions that had been festering for an unknown time. I gagged while trying to remove them without making a bigger mess, but the bag tore, and of course it splashed everywhere. I cried. Story 54. My dog's anal gland juice dripped onto my duvet, and waking up to it in the morning was more than enough. Story 55. The odor of someone who hasn't properly cleaned themselves after using the restroom. This is often observed in many individuals who are morbidly obese or elderly. Story 56. The smell of nothing after getting COVID. When my nose stopped working, everything had faint scents. Story 57. The smell of 5 days' worth of vomit filled the air as I walked through the shopping area after leaving the Glastonbury Festival one year. Story 58. My father and I did appliance repair when I was a teenager, and a disabled man asked us to take away the fridge that was sitting on the back porch. Before even checking it out, my dad said, "Sure, no problem." What we didn't know was that it had been sitting there for over a month, and whoever had put it out there for him didn't bother to remove the food or prop the doors open. The smell that hit me as soon as my dad opened that back door was overwhelming. I saw green ooze dripping from the door and the back of the fridge. My father had already agreed to remove it, and since the man was disabled, we would have felt terrible backing out on our promise. Not thinking clearly, my dad grabbed our appliance dolly and slipped it under the ooze-filled fridge, telling me to strap it down. I felt my stomach churn. As he threw me the strap, it fell right into a puddle of ooze. I gagged audibly. I picked it up, and as I handed it to my dad, the ooze-soaked strap slid along my hand. I started coughing, trying to hold in my lunch. As we began to move it, more of that rancid ooze spilled out onto the dolly. My dad started swearing and gagging. I began to giggle, but then started gagging again. We managed to get it to the side of the road by the garbage cans and left it there. We hosed down the dolly with the neighbor's hose and tried to clean it as much as we could. The dolly had to come in the truck with us, in the dead of summer, with no air conditioning in the van either. That smell stayed with me for months, even weeks after we thought we had gotten rid of it. Please never let me smell it again. I beg of you. Story 59. The smell of a wet dog that rolled in a dead spawning salmon along the riverbank was overwhelming. The drive home was horrendous, but bathing them afterward was far worse. Story 60. I went on vacation and left the car in the airport parking lot for a week. It was hot with temperatures exceeding 30 degrees Celsius. My wife had bought groceries the day before for our house sitter and suddenly hit the brakes at a stoplight. The groceries went flying, and she didn't notice that a half-liter of cream had rolled under the passenger seat, along with a small bag of uncooked shrimp. The smell when we opened the car made us gag, and the kids cried. Even after professional cleaning, we had to sell the car. Story 61. Not the worst smell, but formaldehyde from the cadaver lab in graduate school. We changed out of our normal clothes into our lab clothes in the classroom outside the lab. Everyone just stripped down. It wasn't a big deal. Even so, the smell of those clothes and the lab will live with me forever. Story 62. Sadly, over the years in Florida, I have become familiar with a distinct odor that indicates death. Humans can have a strong smell after dying in the Florida heat and humidity. We lived near several large homeless camps in the woods, where individuals sometimes died and were left until the odor became so strong that authorities were called to investigate. It is a grim reality. Story 63. Durian. A guy at the office brought one of these infamous fruits back from a trip. We were all curious and followed him to the break room. As soon as he cut into it, everyone immediately cleared out. It smelled like an open sewer line, and I thought it must have gone bad. Nope, that's just how they smell. It seriously made everyone gag. Story 64. An accident resulted in lawn chemicals spilling into a man-made lake at a housing community where I worked. It killed hundreds of fish, mostly bass, possibly between 200 and 300. They scooped them up and piled them all in one dumpster. Trash pickup was not for days, so they all rotted in the 110 degrees Fahrenheit summer heat for nearly a week. Story 65. Sour milk. A few decades ago, I went on a day bender and bought supplies to stay at a friend's house without leaving. 3 days later, in the middle of summer, during 40-degree-Celsius days, I opened the car door and found that someone had left 2 liters of milk on the back seat, and it was open. That smell never left the car. I cannot tolerate the scent of warm dairy, even if it is intentional. It makes me feel nauseous. Story 66. Decades ago, my parents went on a big anniversary trip in November. Since they planned to be gone for 2 weeks, I told them I would visit the house every other day to collect the mail and check on things. About halfway through their trip, I came in one evening and noticed a faint but distinctly off smell in the kitchen. They had dumped their trash and cleaned out the refrigerator, so there shouldn't have been anything smelling bad. I sniffed around the house but couldn't find anything and started to wonder if I had imagined the smell. The next day, I had a 2-day business trip that kept me from checking on things, but as soon as I returned, I stopped by again, fresh from a lunch meeting and wearing a suit and tie. As soon as I walked in the door, I smelled something bad, really bad this time. I walked into the kitchen, and the source of the stink was easy to determine. My mother liked to have seasonal centerpieces on her kitchen table. Having just passed Halloween, there was a mid-sized pumpkin surrounded by Indian corn. Oozing out from under the corn was a sticky liquid. Without really thinking, I grabbed a garbage bag to pick up the pumpkin. This is where I made my mistake. As I angled to drop it into the bag I was holding, I grabbed it by the stem. I got it about halfway to the bag when the whole thing fell apart in my hand. The lower half was completely rotten and just fell away. The innards of the 5 to 6 pound pumpkin had turned into a foul semi-liquid slurry, splashing everywhere, on me, in one shoe, under the refrigerator, and all over the lower cabinets. It was vile, and I was lucky my vomit made it to the sink rather than adding to the mess. I had to strip and double bag everything I was wearing in some heavy contractor garbage bags. I opened all the windows, wiped up what I could, and took a shower. I scrubbed away everything I could find and even moved the refrigerator to clean underneath. I found some clothes in my father's closet and left for home. My parents were due back the next day, and when I picked them up at the airport, I gave them the whole story. We walked in their door, and it became immediately apparent that my cleaning had been insufficient. There was still an awful smell in the air. The windows were opened, and we worked to determine where the odor was coming from. It turned out the splash of rotten pumpkin had hit the underside of the cabinets by the toe kick. We applied more elbow grease and thought we had it all cleaned up, but we hadn't. My mother spent the next month or two randomly sniffing around her kitchen and cleaning with various solutions before the last traces of that stench were eradicated. On a side note, my shoe was a write-off, but I took my suit to the dry cleaner and warned them that it was essentially a biohazard situation. They assured me they would do what they could. When I picked it up, it was fine, but they politely asked me never to bring them anything like that again. Story 67. My dad had bowel cancer and issues with his upper and lower gastrointestinal tract because he ignored the blood in his stool. A week before he died, I went to see him in hospice. He had just been to the toilet, and the smell of necrotic bowel movements overwhelmed me. I thought I was going to faint from the odor. I suggested we go for a walk with him in the wheelchair, but he was too exhausted. I had to sit in the room, letting the stench seep into my pores, clothes, and psyche. Story 68. In my mother's basement was a chest freezer that hadn't run in years. It was full of meat, and it was horrific. My brother and I wore respirator masks to clean it out. Story 69. I was pregnant with my first child in August in California. My family was in town for the joyful occasion. I made my dad's famous burritos for 15 people, cleared the table, and left the dishes in the sink to be dealt with in the morning. It was 110 degrees that day in an apartment with no air conditioning. I woke up in the morning in full-blown labor, and off to the hospital we went. 3 days later, our son was born, and we were invited to recover at my parents' home. 10 days later, We returned home to find our apartment infested with maggots and rotting food. You will never forget the smell of maggots in a hot one-bedroom apartment in the middle of summer. Story 70. I used to sell equipment used in poultry processing plants. The smell of dead, dirty chickens still haunts me to this day, especially since the equipment was used in the waste area of the plant. Have you ever wondered where the beaks and feathers go? Story 71. Gastrointestinal bleeding occurred when I worked in the emergency room. The strong odor was a mix of feces and partially digested blood, reminiscent of rust. It was truly unpleasant. Story 72. Gastrointestinal bleeding, specifically the mixture of gastrointestinal blood and feces, is a significant concern. I have also encountered the smell of burning flesh and decomposing bodies, but gastrointestinal bleeding will always stand out for me. Story 73. A partially amputated big toe and old blood wrapped in a trash bag in the summer. Story 74. A dead body and bloody vomit on an Australian summer day in a closed room. I cleaned it so the family didn't have to. Story 75. The smell of pills. When I was about 15 or 16, I tried to take my own life because of a breakup. She cheated on me, and after we broke up, I saw her posting pictures with various guys she was hanging out with. Even her selfies kept me in a constant state of grief all summer. One night, I decided I had heard enough, so I grabbed one of those large bottles of acetaminophen. I went into the bathroom and started shoving handfuls into my mouth, washing them down with water from the sink. I took probably 15 to 20 before my mom's alarm went off for work, and I got scared I would get caught and get in trouble. So I hurried up, threw one more handful in my mouth, put the bottle back, and tried to go to sleep. Long story short, I got violently ill that night, and as soon as I started feeling strange, I immediately regretted it. I was very sick for several days, and when it finally passed, I cried tears of joy, relieved that I hadn't died. From then on, just the smell of any pills made me gag terribly and almost threw me up instantly. I couldn't take any pills for about 5 or 6 years because of how nauseating it made me. I can take pills now, but just the thought of the smell as I take them makes me cringe. Story 76. Oh boy, do I have a story for you. I moved to the United States approximately 9 years ago, and my first job during that time was at an electronics recycling center. It was arduous, to say the least. One of our repeat customers was a local crime scene cleanup crew, which would leave home appliances that had been recovered from houses containing remains in a high level of decomposition. As such, the odor of decay had clung to them. My manager, an overweight man who would tease me relentlessly, was always very dramatically affected by these smells, and he noted how I wasn't. I told him I was there to work, not cry about smells, but I did personally realize how muted my response was compared to his. Every now and then, we'd get refrigerators that we had to disassemble for copper before throwing them in a large open-top container. Very rarely, one of them would have a surprise inside. Rotten meat was one. Another was a literal dead dog that had been left inside. When we got those, my manager would actually stay behind and vomit while I merrily used my impact drill to make easy work of the refrigerators. If the smell felt like it was getting to me, I'd just breathe in, and the sense of disgust dissipated before it had a chance to gain momentum within me. I found it odd. I could smell the decay. I knew it was bad, and I knew that I should be disgusted, but it was as if an internal switch had tripped. The reaction wasn't there. Fast forward a few years, and I'm working at a building materials supplier in the warehouse, and eventually I work so hard they move me to the front. My life is considerably better. I'm getting paid more, and I'm coming out of my shell. I figured that with the extra energy from not working at the warehouse, I could get a part-time job and make a few extra dollars. Providence looked favorably on me, and I found a job as a gas station attendant. 4 hours per shift, barely any significant work to do besides dispatch gas and sell food items, and a lot of time to idle, which I would spend cleaning. One of our regulars, there was a clearly drug-addicted homeless man affected by schizophrenia. He was fairly mild-mannered when he wasn't freaking out, and he was called Napoleon, although he would go into a psychotic rage if called by name. He was wiry, tall, dark-skinned, and always smelled terrible. Yes, even for me then, he smelled terrible. We had a lot of homeless customers, But Napoleon smelled particularly bad, especially when he was getting ready to be picked up by psychiatric staff, which happened regularly in 2-week intervals before he returned to the streets to continue to ruin his life. One day, he came in to buy a cup of ramen noodles, which he had already prepared before approaching the counter. He must have been drinking alcohol or perhaps had some stomach infection because he was vomiting and trying to keep it in his mouth. I always tried to be courteous, nonetheless, and did my best to finish the interaction, figuring I would just clean when he left. But something was different that night. The combination of Napoleon's regular odor, combined with his vomit, and the visual of him vomiting into the cup of ramen noodles, then eating it again, dribbling all over his beard and spilling onto the counter, started getting to me. I figurati di bridine. The sense of disgust would dissipate. And so I didn't. As I inhaled the miasma between us, it pulled at something primal within me, and all the theatrics in the world couldn't have kept me from breaking down. Disgust rose from me, sincere, visceral, and I gagged. So loudly it resonated within the otherwise empty store. It shocked Napoleon, and I swear the expression he made seemed to indicate he had a moment of sobriety in which he felt shame. Meanwhile, on my end, I was in a state of ecstatic rapture. Yes, I was happy. I thought I had lost the sense of disgust, but it was there all along. It just needed something strong enough to awaken it from the dead. I felt thankful. Napoleon rushed to pull crumpled bills and change to pay for his cup of ramen. He left exact change, which I never picked up to place in the register, for his stench clung to them. I sometimes wonder where Napoleon is, and I will forever be thankful to him. I will never forget that smell. I don't even want to remember that smell. It's been about 5 years, and I now have a regular and effective sense of disgust, which works as one would expect. And that's the story. Story 77, Rotting Flesh. My father was sent home after a 5-month hospital stay with an open bedsore as round as a watermelon that exposed his tailbone. There was necrosis surrounding the sore, and I will never forget the smell every time we cleaned him. He died 5 days after leaving the hospital. Story 78. The taste of the tears of an abused child is one of anger, violation, betrayal, and terror. It tastes like the feeling that something is profoundly wrong. Story 79. The fields around my grandparents' house have been sprayed with fresh hot manure on a sunny July day. Story 80. This kid used to sit next to me on the bus during my freshman year of high school. Maybe I'm wrong for never telling him, but we weren't exactly friends. I felt uncomfortable about it. I was still nice to him and sat with him for the year, but I think it's important to take care of personal hygiene. Story 81. I bought raw squid in my teens, intending to make fried squid. I had enjoyed it recently at a restaurant and really liked it. When I got home from the grocery store and opened the bag, the smell hit me hard. I thought that if I stuffed cotton in my nose, I could still manage to cook it. However, it was just too pungent. I finally had to put it back in the bag and take it out to the dumpster. Then I scrubbed every surface it touched. The apartment still smelled for a while afterward. Story 82. Old grease trap. I used to work in a warehouse with an industrial dishwasher and sinks for cleaning dishes that came in from events. The plates would often sit around for days or weeks before being washed, depending on how busy it was, rotting and collecting toxic mold and maggots. The smell was so unbearable that I had to wear a mask to tackle it, and I almost vomited a few times. But that was nothing compared to where all those decaying fats went down the drain. When we opened up the grease trap in the floor after a year of buildup, it was like the scene from a movie where a mysterious artifact is uncovered. I immediately threw up and couldn't breathe. The stench was ghastly, indescribable. Thousands of dead animal fats congealed into a thick brown sludge that I was supposed to suck out with a vacuum into a garbage bag. No way. We had to hire a professional grease trap cleaner because I couldn't come within 10 feet of that hole without retching violently or vomiting into the nearest trash can. Story 83. Decomposing body. Last July, I found my dear friend after not hearing from her for 4 days. The 100-degree heat daily is forever burned in my brain. I had to throw away the clothes I was wearing, even my shoes, after washing them twice. My car took a long time to air out, as the scent lingered on my clothes, making me nauseous just thinking about it. Story 84. A turtle that died rotting in its tank with about 6 inches of water. It was the only time my body gagged involuntarily, aside from drinking. Story 85. Burning human flesh. A fatal electrocution at work several years ago. It's a smell you'll never forget, and it is never associated with anything good. Story 86. I have not experienced the original, but I have smelled something similar to what is referred to as the swamps of Dagoba. Story 87. A dead body was decomposing in a hot apartment for a long time. The poor individual was mostly liquefied, with maggots and flies present. Interestingly, my colleague did not want to check the person's pants pockets for a wallet to identify him. While it seemed pointless at that stage, it was meant as humor directed at my colleague. Story 88. I was a nursing assistant at an inpatient physical rehabilitation facility and took a patient to the bathroom for a shower. He was alert and oriented, recovering from surgery. I set him up on the shower bench, started the water, and gave him some privacy while I waited outside the door. Shortly after, I began to smell something foul. When he said he was done, I opened the door to help him back to his wheelchair and saw a mess. The combination of the hot shower and the unpleasant smell was overwhelming. I will never forget it. This was back in 2017, and I was pregnant at the time. Story 89. Rotten potatoes emit a smell that is unlike any other, practically liquefying. Story 90. I had to wait with the body of a man I knew who had been dead for several days while we waited for the police. It was unpleasant. I couldn't shake the smell from my hair, or at least it felt that way. Story 91. I was trying to help my cousin who was going through major depression. He had abandoned his condo for over a year and had stopped paying the electric bill. The condo reeked from the outside, and the smell was overwhelming. I was not prepared for what I encountered in the fridge. When I opened the door, the odor almost knocked me out. It was a year's worth of rotting meat, milk, and food, with millions of dead maggots, worms, and flies. Story 92. I encountered a decaying dog corpse in a garbage bag a few days ago while walking back to my house in a rough neighborhood. I was relieved it wasn't a human, but the odor was detectable from a street away. The smell of rotting flesh is undoubtedly one of the most unpleasant experiences. Story 93. Rotten potatoes for sure, as rotting flesh is the worst for me. My aunt had breast cancer, and her entire breast was decaying. That smell was unlike anything I have ever encountered in my life. Story 94. Certain elderly people have a distinct smell. I've never been able to figure out what it is. It's not any product they are using, and not all of them have it. I don't even know how to describe it beyond slightly rotten and sharp. I strongly dislike it. By elderly, I mean those aged 60 and above. Story 95. The dog I was caring for had serious gastrointestinal issues. I have cleaned up a lot of messes in the past, but this was different. One time, I cleaned a pile of diarrhea that also contained vomit, which was more manageable than this. What came out of this dog once had the consistency of snot. I found it difficult to approach the waste without feeling nauseated. I spoke with both the owner and a veterinarian about the situation. The veterinarian suggested that the raw food provided by the owner had likely spoiled. Although all of it was placed in the freezer when I received it, something may have gone wrong during transit. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.